Well, dear listeners, today's lecture bears a living relation to one of my earlier talks, Irish Vampirism before Dracula. From that earlier inquiry, the present occasion draws a certain intellectual kinship, though its path moves upon its own ground and arrives with its own centre of gravity. My purpose here is to open a fuller consideration of Bram Stoker's work, together with the period of his life in which Dracula gathered shape beneath his hand, acquired pressure in his imagination, and entered the world through labour sustained across time. The peculiar temptation attends Stoker's name. The mind hastens toward the finished count, toward that sealed figure whom later culture rendered instantly legible, with the result that the deeper interest of the book's formation slips from view. Dracula deserves attention first as an achievement of composition, research, imaginative persistence, and historical absorption before it assumes the authority of myth. A work of this kind gathers force over time, as reading deepens into resource, professional discipline steadies the hand, apprehension acquires contour under pressure of experience, remembered encounters with places and persons leave a durable afterimage, and the age itself impresses its visible machinery together with its concealed fears upon the writer's imagination. Stoker interests me, then, as a writer lodged within a distinct historical moment, receiving from that moment a charged mixture of energy, tension, and habitual thought, then translating that pressure into narrative form. My concern this evening lies within that act of translation by which experience acquires pattern, research condenses into image, and a man moving through the late 19th century gradually brings forth a figure whose reach extends far beyond the immediate circumstances of its making. For that reason, today's lecture assumes a somewhat different shape from some of the others I have given. I shall proceed in a more narrative mode, allowing the material to unfold through scene, circumstance, atmosphere, together with argument, so that the subject may appear in motion and in texture, instead of standing before us as a sequence of isolated claims. Such a form suits Stoker especially well, for his work arose at a charged threshold where literary creation, personal experience, cultural memory, and historical unease pressed closely upon one another, each leaving its mark upon the other. So I invite you now into a lecture fully independent in its own right, though it remains in quiet conversation with what came before, a lecture devoted to Bram Stoker, to the years in which Dracula took shape, and to the shadowed labour through which one of modern literature's most enduring figures entered the world. Which force truly governs Dracula, the gush of blood or the page that receives its report? I have carried that question for years, largely through one image the novel places before the reader with unusual insistence. A packet, a sheaf, a gathered body of journals, phonograph cylinders, memoranda, ship's logs, letters, newspaper clippings, telegrams, legal records, business notes, witness statements. Public memory fastens upon the vampire's visible emblems, teeth, Cape Castle wolves, mist brides, seduction, plague, and from those emblems it fashions the mythology most readers inherit before they open the book. Within the novel itself, however, another principle holds the narrative together, for paper, record, and transcription furnish the medium through which fear becomes knowledge, pursuit becomes method, and scattered experience acquires collective form. Dracula enters the story as a creature of appetite and bodily trespass, yet the text that bears his name keeps returning to acts of notation, preservation, comparison, and arrangement. His movement belongs to darkness, secrecy, and predation. The counter-movement mounted against him proceeds through writing, copying, filing, dictation, and the disciplined circulation of evidence. Blood gives the monster his immediate power, while transcription gives the novel its durable intelligence. In that imbalance, the book discloses its central mechanism, for Stoker presents a monster to the imagination, then surrounds him with an archive whose very structure shapes the terms through which he can be apprehended, pursued, and finally understood. What kind of labour, then, does that archive perform? Through what narrative logic does a tale involving invasion, bodily peril, erotic panic, ancestral taint, national fear, religious struggle, legal pursuit, shipping intelligence, property transfer, technological modernity, marriage, childbirth, memory, contagion, race, empire, logistics, wolves, bats, weatherless dread, grave soil, sleepwalking, transfusion, maps, railway timetables, shorthand, typewriting, stenography, medicine, lunacy, criminal anthropology, folklore, law, masculinity, female, desire, imperial circulation, Christian symbols, domestic labor, frontier travel, sewage routes, harbor records, ethnographic rumor, bureaucratic procedure, collective authorship, dead mothers, absent fathers, and the old dread of inheritance reach us in the form of a dossier? My answer proceeds through 4 movements. In the first, I place Bram Stoker within the late Victorian machinery that shaped his habits of mind: administration, theatre management, imperial circulation, clerical procedure, legal memory, professional mobility, public record. In the second, I turn to blood, the novel's governing liquid, though the term carries a range far beyond substance alone, for blood in Dracula signifies kinship, race thought, title, contamination, sacrament, theft, entry into the family line. A third movement follows the night road itself, tracing passages by coach, ship, train, river, cart, corridor, graveyard path, sewer run, mountain pass, each route carrying narrative traffic while also serving as imperial artery, folkloric border, and structural hinge. The fourth addresses the grammar of the uncanny, by which I mean the formal procedures through which the familiar comes under a pressure scarcely bearable to it: repetition, delay, transcription, partial witness, physical interruption, official detail set beside impossible event. By the close, I mean to show that Dracula stands among the most intelligent late 19th century novels on inheritance precisely through its conversion of blood into record, fear into paperwork, supernatural dread into a modern file. The vampire enters England by sea. The novel answers him through compilation. Bram Stoker entered literary history through a curious side door. Public memory has often confined him within the image of a solitary masterpiece, while his years at the Lyceum, his association with Henry Irving, and his long managerial career in the theatre's wings have remained secondary features in the story told about him. That reduction has always seemed inadequate to me, for it leaves out the very disciplines that made his fiction possible. Stoker worked in the theatre, certainly, yet he also served in Dublin Castle, travelled widely, kept notes, handled schedules, correspondence, personalities, contracts, publicity, touring arrangements, literary ambitions, practical delays. He moved through worlds in which paper carried authority, preserved sequence, and conferred legitimacy upon action. One need not recast him as a mere clerk in order to grasp what clerical order supplied to his imagination, for the decisive gift lay in habits of assembly, in the management of fragments, in a faith that scattered testimony could be marshalled into an operative whole. Dracula bears those habits on nearly every page. The book proceeds through accumulation instead of continuous omniscient flow. It verifies, dates, collates, and places one form of witness beside another until a composite body of evidence rises from the assembled pile. That procedure belongs to the novel's historical hour. Late Victorian Britain inhabited paperwork with unusual intensity, as census culture, shipping records, timetables, property deeds, asylum notes, medical casebooks, criminal dossiers, legal transfers, memoranda of understanding, commercial letters, advertisements, newsprint, imperial intelligence, and travel literature together produced a civilization that entrusted inscription with a fervour almost theological in force. Entry into a ledger conferred public existence upon a fact, appearance in a register brought a body within administration, and passage across a desk bound a letter into a chain of consequence whose reach extended beyond the room of writing. Stoker knew that culture from within, for Dublin Castle schooled him in bureaucratic discipline, the Lyceum instructed him in logistics under pressure, and touring impressed upon him the truth that movement depended upon booking, scheduling, routes, rooms, money, luggage, and timing. His fiction thinks through such instruments, and allows their procedures to shape the terms in which experience becomes intelligible. At this point the packet turns. Dracula opens with Jonathan Harker's journal, a traveller's account that soon acquires the force of a legal record visited by fear. Harker travels east in order to conduct property business, and the Englishman's passage abroad begins under the sign of commerce, with professional purpose packed into his bag and committed to paper across inns, coaches, rail cars, and castles. Along that route, Stoker arranges a dense field of perception in which tourist observation, professional scrutiny, imperial habit, ethnographic attention, and mounting fear converge, allowing Harker's prose to gather foods, dress, dialect, peasant custom, local warnings, church objects, landscape forms, routes, maps, and business matters within a single act of notice. As peril thickens, the syntax changes, yet the impulse to record endures, and that endurance carries the deepest structural weight in the sequence. Harker crosses into a zone where ordinary explanation yields to pressure, while his hand continues its work of notation, giving visible form to a modern subject's encounter with the pre-modern uncanny. One of Stoker's finest structural decisions lies here in the choice to begin with practical prose under strain, so that the uncanny enters a recognizable record-keeping form, and terror gains peculiar force through pages that appear honest, dated, procedural, ordinary, almost drab at first glance. The later impossibility grows within those habits of notation which lends the supernatural a documentary gravity that mere marvel could never achieve. That habit reveals much about empire. I am pursuing a stronger claim than the familiar gesture that treats every Victorian object as an emblem of British domination. For the deeper pressure lies in the forms of perception empire cultivated within the subjects who moved through its circuits. Imperial culture trained attention through classification, mapped space, described populations, and regions opened by railway and steamship together established a world made available to survey, comparison, and use. Commercial expansion moved through transport, translation, contracts, consular knowledge, comparative law, and market intelligence. Harker travels into Eastern Europe, already equipped with categories through which location, ownership, language, connection, and settlement can be rendered legible. His curiosity carries the tone of civility, though within it there operates a firmer pressure directed toward possession and transfer. The imperial subject reads difference through acquisitive intelligence, and knowledge prepares conveyance title and exchange before any scene of visible predation arrives. Prospective transfer gathers around land, property, and inheritance from the opening stages of the plot, until the purchase of English real estate by a foreign nobleman gives legal possession a decisive narrative force. Dracula's earliest action therefore concerns the acquisition of houses long before his appetite reaches the vein. That fact deserves greater weight than casual accounts of the novel usually grant it. Count Dracula enters England through real estate, and his advance proceeds by way of conveyancing, language study, cartographic consultation, legal intermediaries, boxes of native earth, multiple properties, and a metropolitan network that disperses the material conditions of his presence. One aspect of the vampire presents a predatory aristocrat, another reveals a modern investor, planner of logistics, a strategist who understands distributed occupation. Through that doubleness, the old noble body enters modern circulation. Stoker thus constructs a figure at once archaic and mobile, feudal and capitalist, ancestral and adaptive. Many monsters dwell in remote ruins. Dracula purchases suburban property. From that point onward, the English response begins to assume the shape of counterintelligence. Mina gathers papers, Van Helsing compares testimonies, Dr. Seward preserves phonographic records, newspapers yield clues, and telegraphic speed aids the pursuit, so that movement through the city comes to resemble passage across a networked field of information. The group engages the supernatural through holy objects, yet its deeper strength resides in the assembly of knowledge, in the conversion of scattered impressions into a disciplined record of threat. Mina's role carries special force within that process. Her labor of typing, ordering, duplicating, and cross-referencing transforms dispersed witness into an instrument fit for use, and one might say that the modern anti-vampire coalition depends in large measure upon feminized clerical skill. The men bring law, medicine, finance, title, force, and social standing. Mina gives evidence, form, sequence, and operational clarity, thereby creating the conditions through which action can proceed. At this stage, one sees why the archive in Dracula bears weight far beyond decoration. What emerges through it is a civilizational contest in which Dracula figures a survival from a deep aristocratic past, sharpened by migratory cunning, while the hunters embody a bourgeois professional order grounded in cooperation, evidence, circulation of information, practical trust, technology, piety, domestic feeling, masculine and female managerial intelligence. Sentimentality, however, would obscure the harder truth carried by that coalition, for its archive also enacts violence through gathering, classification, interpretation, comparison, extraction, transfer, and pursuit, each operation belonging to the exercise of power. The empire that sends timetables across a continent also sends troops, goods, administrators, extractive law, census logic, and racial theory. Stoker's novel possesses an active knowledge of that connection, even at moments when the insight remains implicit within the action. Dracula threatens England. England answers through the very capacities that empire trained to a high pitch of effectiveness. Blood enters here as the second movement, though its presence has shadowed the argument from the opening line through latent implication. Travel, contract, title, inheritance, kinship, and noble descent each carry blood within their structure, so that the vampire's action reaches beyond the infliction of a wound toward insertion into line itself and penetration of the grammar of descent. That deeper pressure helps explain the force with which Dracula unsettled its first readers, for the horror gathers around altered inheritance as much as around visible injury. Questions of blood therefore become questions of succession, filiation, household continuity, and corporeal entry. Whose blood runs here, whose child follows whom, which house passes to which line, what enters the body through violation, appetite, seduction, or medicine. The novel circles these matters with sustained intensity, and the pressure persists across its languages of science, marriage, patriotism, Christian duty, criminality, degeneration, madness, and disease. Within Victorian culture, blood carried several overlapping meanings whose convergence gave the term unusual force. It signified family, race, noble title, vitality, gendered danger, menstruation, childbirth, injury, sacrifice, Eucharistic mystery within Christian memory, criminal trace within emerging sciences of heredity and anthropological type, national stock, and inherited taint. Stoker draws upon every one of these pressures. Lucy Westenra's Decline offers the clearest example for 3 men, then 4 through Van Helsing's symbolic participation, pour blood into her body in a scene that begins as modern medical procedure yet soon expands into a charged nexus of marital implication, sexual rivalry, sacrifice, chivalric display, and communal exchange. Under those conditions, the question of whose blood lives in Lucy acquires unusual force, and with it comes the parallel question of what relation each man claims to her person through the act of transfusion. Van Helsing's language frequently trembles between clinical sobriety and ritual intensity, which gives Lucy a central place within the novel's symbolic economy. In her medicine, desire, kinship, religion, race thinking, male fellowship, female vulnerability, and the fears surrounding human permeability gather within a single emblematic figure. I have always thought that the transfusion scenes disclose the novel's deepest panic about modern intimacy. Blood passes from one body into another outside ordinary reproductive sequence, and the intervention of technology makes that transfer possible while preserving the full symbolic pressure of older sacramental and familial meanings. A woman receives the blood of several male donors, so her body becomes a crossing point for masculine substance, fantasy, claim, and obligation. Under such conditions, each man may imagine himself savior, husband, rival, father, martyr, with every role pressing upon the others until the scene acquires a density far beyond medical procedure alone. Lucy's chamber becomes the place where an inherited language of chastity encounters a modern apparatus of circulation, and Stoker allows the collision to remain active in all its disturbance. Within that unresolved pressure, one hears late Victorian masculine anxiety in one of its fullest registers, where devotion carries the accent of ownership, tenderness draws close to terror, rescue gathers the force of jealousy, and scientific confidence moves in company with archaic dread. Lucy's transformation into the Bloofer lady carries that pressure further. Blood now appears as predatory appetite joined to a distorted maternity, so that the woman once cherished as fiancée returns as a figure who takes children, shines with dangerous allure, summons desire, and consumes what she draws near. Through that change, the beloved woman becomes an image of erotic threat moving beyond the domestic frame, and her undead condition stages a nightmare form of female mobility, active at night, governed by appetite, beautiful in altered form. Stoker thereby converts masculine fear of female sexual agency into a monster organized around inheritance, for Lucy seems poised to found a line through violation and to transmit blood outside sanctioned descent. The staking scene that follows therefore derives its gruesome force from the effort to restore order to blood through piercing exposure, severance, purification, and release. Savage intensity, tenderness, exultation, horror, and an almost liturgical solemnity all gather in the ritual, until the destruction of the body appears as the means through which identity can return to its proper place. The whole sequence reveals how thin the border remains within the novel's moral imagination between sacrament and execution. One may approach the novel by emphasizing Dracula chiefly as a foreign invader, a racialized outsider who threatens English womanhood. That reading carries genuine force, yet the book opens further dimensions when one grants fuller weight to the historical density Stoker gives his vampire. The Count comes from elsewhere, certainly, and his speech bears strange cadences shaped by local histories, border wars, mixed genealogies, obscure titles, mountain legends, peasant customs, and ancient claims. He also belongs deeply to Europe itself, appearing as a dark aristocratic remnant in whom crusade memory, Ottoman struggle, feudal ferocity, migratory violence, dynastic pride, military endurance, and historical grievance have been compacted into a single revenant form. England recoils before him in part through fear of foreign contamination, while another pressure moves beside that response, the fear that the violence of European history, from which Imperial Britain has drawn profit while clothing itself in civility, may return to the metropolitan centre embodied in a single figure. That recognition alters the theme of inheritance. Dracula threatens English bloodlines, yet he also mirrors the older blood myths through which ruling orders have long justified their own authority. His speech dwells upon lineage, invokes ancient victories, and proceeds as if history itself circulates in his veins. Such utterance exposes aristocratic ideology in an unusually naked condition, presenting blood as the bearer of right, memory, command, and possession within a single inherited logic of power. The Count therefore appears at once alien to bourgeois England and intensely legible to its class imagination. His boast sounds medieval, while also resembling a grim parody of every order founded upon dissent. If monstrosity defines him here, that monstrosity emerges through an exaggerated concentration of principles long cherished within European social thought. Mina Harker complicates the issue still further. After Dracula forces his blood upon her, inheritance passes from abstract concern into an immediate crisis of the flesh, and the novel's language of branding, pollution, entry, claim, transmission, and future danger rises to a striking pitch of harshness. Mina, nevertheless, becomes the book's most intelligent point of contact, for her partial bond with Dracula grants the group a form of access through which contact with the enemy yields knowledge, and corrupted passage becomes instrument. One of Stoker's boldest decisions lies here, in his placing of the woman the men seek to protect upon the charged threshold where danger and method meet. Mina stands there as an endangered person and an indispensable medium, a figure whose role exceeds the limits of any simple Victorian purity code through the full range of what she does. She suffers, thinks, compiles, guides, remembers, resists. Her blood bond subjects her to the threat of an altered destiny, while also drawing her into the interpretive centre of the action. Inheritance in Dracula therefore runs along several lines at once, extending through family, title, race thought, nation, religion, memory, and transmission through the flesh. Another order of inheritance emerges through the movement of the text, as documents carry witness forward across successive acts of reading, handling, and judgment. Medium itself acquires a hereditary force when handwritten journal becomes typed copy, spoken recollection becomes record, and local rumour enters metropolitan understanding. Stoker appears fascinated by the way one thing passes into another while retaining a dangerous trace of origin. Blood gives that passage its form in the flesh. The archive gives it textual form. Every fear in the novel gathers around transfer. Now I move to the night road, and I do so with care, inasmuch as many readers carry Dracula in memory as a castle-bound narrative interrupted by a handful of urban pursuits. My own reading places the novel among the great road books of the 19th century, though its routes run under the sign of dread and carry the traveller toward exposure instead of enlargement. Harker's eastward progress unfolds by train, carriage, coach, horseback, and finally through the Count's own vehicle. Dracula crosses by sea on the Demeter, boxes move from place to place, the chase threads through London. The final pursuit stretches across Europe by train, riverboat, carriage, and horse. Even interior spaces submit to the logic of route, for corridor, stair, window, cemetery path, chapel approach, sewer entrance, lunatic asylum passage, and the approach to the bedroom at night all become channels through which danger advances. Motion governs the work at every level. One might say that Dracula becomes a road novel at the moment when the road ceases to promise liberal self-development and begins instead to expose the travelling subject to ancient hunger moving within modern systems. The opening journey stands among the finest sequences in English prose of its period. Harker passes beyond the familiar Western network, and with that passage timetables begin to fray, connections loosen, languages multiply, and the map yields a diminishing obedience to his expectations. Around him local warnings gather, hospitality itself acquires pressure, and food becomes a medium of cultural density. Crosses, garlic, peasant gestures, whispered names, trouble among the horses, wolves sounding at a distance, and the blue flames along the road together allow Stoker to compose a geography in which movement itself becomes an act of interpretation. The traveller passes from one order of explanation into another, and what continues to enthrall me in this sequence lies in Harker's sustained trust in routes, even while the route educates him into fear. The road carries him deeper with every stage. Each interval holds out the promise of arrival, and each arrival strips confidence from the promise that preceded it. In that sense, the journey functions as an initiation conducted through infrastructure. That term carries weight. In Dracula, infrastructure bears an uncanny charge, for railways aid knowledge while also enabling pursuit, ships sustain commerce while also conveying plague, and telegraphic speed assists the hunters even as the enemy displays a remarkable agility within the same communicative field. Roads open the east to English entry, yet those very routes reverse their vector once Dracula moves westward. Empire imagines movement under the sign of mastery. Stoker recasts movement as a condition of exposure and susceptibility within a shared network of transit. England occupies the very circuits it seeks to command. Through those channels come commodities, travellers, and dangers alike. Through that arrangement, a single aristocratic predator equipped with legal intelligence can move across the systems imperial modernity celebrates as achievements of order. The voyage of the Demeter condenses this logic with exceptional force. Here the road takes maritime form, and a ship's log, that sober instrument of nautical record, registers a passage from ordinary transport into supernatural attrition. Members of the crew disappear one by one. Order gives way beneath an experience that official language can register only through fragments. The vessel reaches Whitby as a ghostly machine bearing cargo, death, foreign earth, and an archive within which blood travels under concealment. Few episodes in Victorian fiction strike me as more exact in method. Stoker selects a form devoted to precision, the captain's log, then allows terror to hollow out its authority from within. Successive entries grow narrower. Every note gathers force through restraint. The uncanny leaves record in place, though under pressure it becomes attenuated, reduced to a residue that bears witness to the failure of customary explanation. The reader therefore encounters dread through the disciplined remainder of maritime notation under siege, where procedural language endures even while the world it serves passes into bewilderment. Whitby itself deserves a pause. Abbey, graveyard, coast, storm-driven arrival, Lucy's sleepwalking, and the mingling of local picturesque with predatory visitation allow Stoker to fashion the site as a hinge between tourist England and a haunted littoral. The seaside resort meets the old ecclesial ruin, respectable holiday life meets the newspaper notice, the dog leaping ashore and the body tied to the wheel. Out of that conjunction comes a sharp collision between public leisure and archaic dread. At Whitby, the coast becomes threshold, and England's island image, so often cast in the form of a defensive bulwark, yields to a vision of permeability through which the nation receives its monster by harbour. The London sections extend that logic into urban form. Dracula disperses boxes across the city, while the hunters pursue addresses, divide responsibilities, move by carriage, and send information across an increasingly connected field, so that London emerges as a pattern of nodes linked by circulation and search. The Count, once associated with a remote castle, now inhabits metropolitan movement, learns the city through transport, uses density as concealment, and secures himself within a network of properties. Stoker proves himself an able novelist of the city here, more accomplished in that mode than many readers grant. Within London, the road appears in logistical form, scheduled, surveyed, commercial, crowded with purpose. Dread flourishes there all the same, and that pressure carries weight for the novel's argument, inasmuch as the uncanny enters the capital itself, takes rooms, and moves by night across modern streets. The final pursuit eastward reverses Harker's first journey while transforming its meaning. At the opening, the English traveller entered unfamiliar territory as a professional intermediary animated by practical purpose. Near the close, the multinational hunting party follows the Count toward his native ground with knowledge sharpened by ordeal and directed toward rescue, vengeance, urgency, and strategy. Snow and mountain test the pursuers, while the deepest pressure gathers around time itself, for sunset approaches, and the box demands interception before darkness grants the Count renewed advantage. Route calculation proceeds with modern exactitude, even as the company entrusts itself to horse, cart, river, local guide, and rugged terrain. Stoker once again joins older forms of movement to modern method, until the chase assumes the shape of a contest between ancient cunning rooted in place and a coordinated intelligence sustained by files, maps, clocks, and vows. One reason the road carries such weight lies in its power to externalize the novel's temporal conflict. Roads join epochs within a single line of movement. Along one stretch of track, a train rushes forward with industrial speed. At the next stage, a coach proceeds under the authority of ancestral custom. Modern documents pass into medieval stone in the solicitor's hands, while a noble corpse enclosed in a box crosses a commercial shipping line. Stoker returns to such collisions repeatedly, and they generate the novel's true atmosphere more fully than mist or bat flight ever could. The deepest eeriness in Dracula emerges whenever distinct temporal regimes occupy the same route, so that travel unfolds in the present while the past takes its place beside the traveller and claims equal force. That overlap brings me to the grammar of the uncanny, and I use the term grammar with full intent. In Dracula, the uncanny arises through arrangement as much as through theme or image, for its force depends upon syntax, sequence, framing, recurrence, delay, interruption, formal juxtaposition, and the pressure exerted upon ordinary descriptive language when the object before it exceeds accepted categories. One may invoke the familiar becoming strange, the domestic receiving archaic fear, or the return of buried pressure into daily life, and each of those formulations carries interpretive value. Stoker's strongest achievement, however, lies in the precision with which he engineers that sensation sentence by sentence and document by document. Consider first the dated entry. A date promises order, gives experience a place upon a line, and marks one day in relation to the next. In Dracula, that promise often intensifies dread through the confidence it appears to guarantee, for the word today seems to belong to rational sequence, even when the event recorded under it strains the habits by which sequence usually produces meaning. From that tension comes the eerie effect. The reader places trust in the diary form, while the diary proceeds to report events that press against ordinary explanation. Trust, therefore, remains active even as certainty loosens, and within that suspended relation the uncanny finds one of its most fertile forms. Consider next the multiplication of witnesses. A lone narrator can appear vulnerable to distortion, whereas testimony distributed across distinct stations, media genders, professions, and national backgrounds generates a field of corroboration through which the impossible acquires evidential density. Stoker handles that process with remarkable control. Harker's record of the castle, Lucy's symptoms, Seward's clinical observations, Renfield's behaviour, Mina's compilations, newspaper notices, ship's logs, and telegrams each carry a local strangeness when taken in isolation. Brought together, they disclose a pattern whose force exceeds any single testimony. Uncanny knowledge thus arises through accumulation and concordance. In place of the older Gothic design, where a solitary explorer tears open a hidden chamber of truth, Stoker gives the reader a modern form of collaborative dread, assembled across multiple acts of witness and sustained by the convergence of independent records. Renfield serves as one of the novel's most subtle formal instruments. Casual recollection often reduces him to grotesque comic spectacle, the madman who eats flies, yet his deeper work within the book lies elsewhere. He functions as a human barometer of invisible pressure, allowing the reader to feel Dracula's nearness before full revelation takes shape. His speech circles around life consumption, graduated orders of feeding, relations of mastery and submission, habits of counting, patterns of accumulation, and fantasies of extracted vitality, so that his discourse both anticipates and distorts the vampire's logic. Seward's clinical record intensifies the effect by placing Renfield inside a medical discourse committed to classification and case history. The case, however, keeps opening toward a metaphysical horizon that stretches beyond psychiatric command. Once again, Stoker brings a modern explanatory language into immediate contact with the impossible. The uncanny emerges precisely at that point of contact. Repetition provides another key to the novel's method. Recurring windows, vulnerable throats, night entry, the woman in bed, the vowed company of men, blood upon lips, and the charged relation between host and house establish a pattern that gathers force through return. Similar work is performed by crucifix, garlic wafer, circle box, earth door, threshold, invitation, and exclusion, each reappearing with slight variation from scene to scene until the novel develops a ritual syntax of signs. The reader gradually enters a world in which familiar objects retain their material presence while acquiring an added pressure that exceeds ordinary use. Such doubleness stands near the center of the uncanny in Dracula. The bedroom remains recognizable as a domestic chamber, yet within the novel it also becomes a site of invasion, sleep, seduction, predation, sanctification, and surveillance. Freight retains its ordinary form in the box, although that same object carries the force of coffin, homeland, womb, cache, contract shipment, and mobile sanctuary. Even the page keeps its common identity while assuming, within this narrative economy, the grave office of a defense against oblivion. The novel's language around women has drawn sustained criticism, and much of that criticism carries force. Lucy and Mina live under a relentless male scrutiny that turns their persons into interpretive battlegrounds upon which chastity, purity, danger, motherhood, contamination, courage, submission, and labor are variously inscribed. Precision of reading, however, reveals instability within that arrangement. Lucy's transformations expose masculine panic, while at the same time bringing masculine desire into the open with unusual clarity. Mina receives praise in terms designed to preserve her within the horizon of Victorian ideal womanhood, yet her actual function presses far beyond that inherited frame, for her intelligence orders evidence, her judgment guides action, and her endurance sustains ethical clarity under pressure, even as partial contamination draws her toward peril. The novel repeatedly seeks a language adequate to her through the refraction of masculine virtue into female form, as though the available vocabulary had arrived before the culture possessed a settled way of naming a woman of such capacity. At that point, the uncanny reaches gender at a structural depth, because familiar roles remain visible even as lived capacities exceed the social forms meant to contain them. Religion enters this grammar with a peculiar boldness. Crucifix, host, prayer, consecrated ground, spiritual warfare, damnation, and salvation furnish the novel with Christian substance in a mode that many modern readers receive as earnest to the point of discomfort. My own reading moves elsewhere, because Stoker treats the sacramental object as a genuine counterforce to vampiric violation, while situating that force within a world saturated by modern technologies of evidence. Faith works beside method, while method in turn proceeds within a field where faith retains operative force. Archive and sacrament therefore move together, and that conjunction stands among the book's deepest signatures. When the wafer touches Mina's forehead and leaves a scar, the sacred object writes upon flesh with the authority of an inscription. Through that act the packet returns in altered form, as record impressed upon the body, and body rendered legible as record. At this point, a question often asked in blunt form becomes answerable with greater care. Does Dracula belong to reaction or to modernity? The answer lies in the grammar I have been tracing. The novel reaches toward both, though the word carries tension within it instead of settlement. Its desires move toward moral clarity, masculine fidelity, domestic sanctity, Christian assurance, national survival, and genealogical continuity. Its form, meanwhile, depends upon fractured documents, unstable witnesses, imported knowledge, female clerical mastery, invasive technologies, transnational pursuit, human permeability, racial anxiety, legal networks, urban systems, and scientific language placed under strain. Put another way, the novel seeks restoration through forms generated by crisis. The uncanny appears precisely at the point where the work's restorative longing encounters the full force of what its own narrative procedures have already disclosed. One can see the pattern clearly in the conclusion. Dracula meets destruction before full nightfall, the body collapses into dust, Quincy gives his life, Mina enters release, and a child arrives later bearing names drawn from memory and male fellowship. The coda moves toward domestic closure, yet the packet of papers continues to exist, and those documents endure as the archive of ordeal. 7 years pass, inherited names settle upon the child, the family line moves forward, and England appears preserved within the terms the novel most values. Even so, the book held in the reader's hands remains a dossier shaped by contamination, fear, violation, pursuit, partial witness, and human crisis in the flesh. Closure therefore carries earnest force without shedding complexity, for the archive preserves what the domestic future seeks to gather into continuity and peace. I return at this point to Bram Stoker himself, chiefly in order to resist the temptation to treat Dracula as an accidental vessel for large historical abstractions. Stoker was a maker whose imagination worked through disciplined acts of gathering, selection, and arrangement. Deep reading in travel narrative, folklore, criminal theory, history, ethnographic fragments, and newspaper material fed that imaginative labor, while stubborn note-taking and careful scene construction gave it durable form. The theatre taught him the management of entrances, exits, delays, tableaus, revelation, secondary voices, and suspense, and the dramatist's intelligence remains visible throughout Dracula. At decisive moments, doors open under pressure, circles of listeners form around spoken testimony, bodies lie displayed before watchers, rooms take on the tension of a stage prepared for disclosure. Even the packet of papers carries the force of a prop laid upon a table before an assembled company. The archive in the novel therefore lives as something warmer, tenser, and more kinetic than cold storage, for it acts as dramaturgy conducted through documents. Another biographical pressure deserves a place here. Stoker came from Ireland, received formation within a kingdom ordered from London, passed through Anglo-Irish institutions, pursued ambition through imperial circuits, and gained intimate knowledge of centralized administration while living at a slight distance from the metropolis that bestowed literary prestige. I approach crude equations between Irishness and vampirism, or between colonial relation and every figure of invasion, with considerable caution, for such readings quickly lose texture and proportion. A more disciplined claim may be stated. Stoker understood, from within his own formation, the strain produced when nearness to power coexists with imbalance. Institutional participation carries the mark of displacement, and belonging itself acquires the texture of unease. Dracula repeatedly imagines center and margin in dynamic relation. The border answers back, the periphery carries old powers, and the capital receives what it once imagined safely elsewhere. Those pressures become legible in a writer shaped at the edge of imperial confidence. One should add, too, that the novel arrives at the close of the 19th century, amid a horizon crowded by degeneration theory, imperial overreach, migration, urban crowding, class unrest, scientific revision, sexual debate, new woman discourse, public health fear, criminal anthropology, syphilitic panic, hereditary anxiety, anti-Semitic fantasy, Eastern European volatility, religious uncertainty, spiritualism, evolutionary thought, and mass print culture. Dracula gathers energy from many of these pressures and brings them into active relation within a single narrative field, which helps explain the book's continuing richness for serious readers. Its power lies in more than historical illustration. Stoker concentrates the age's tensions in a figure at once almost absurdly concrete, a man with teeth resting in a box of earth, and formally elastic enough to receive each generation's fresh deposit of dread. Through that strange union of material specificity and symbolic range, the vampire becomes a site where the centuries' crowded anxieties acquire memorable shape. Cinema later granted Dracula an immense afterlife, though film frequently narrowed the character's original complexity. Iconic costuming swelled into emblem, stylized accent hardened into cliché, seductive presence eclipsed strategic intelligence, and solitary charisma displaced the collective archive that gives the novel much of its power. I can value those films, as I do in uneven degrees, while preserving a clear sense of what many of them surrender in the passage from page to screen. Stoker's Dracula inspires terror less through aristocratic glamour than through procedural adaptability, for he learns, purchases, studies, infiltrates systems, converts intimacy into access, and turns logistics into a weapon. His power depends upon movement across forms and functions: nobleman, host, corpse, mist, animal, shipborne cargo, legal client, urban proprietor, midnight invader. In that respect, he bears a marked resemblance to the modern threat, which prospers through circulation, mutation, and networked presence. For that reason, the packet in Mina's hands remains the novel's truest counter-image. Within its gathered pages, dispersal meets an ordering intelligence, seduction encounters the discipline of comparison, and isolated terror enters the shared authority of record. Even so, paper by itself supplies only part of the needed force. The coalition also requires courage, physical action, holy resolve, local knowledge, endurance on the road, readiness to risk blood, and a disciplined willingness to grant that realities exceeding current explanation may still be named with accuracy. Stoker therefore presents a mixed economy of survival in which practical record, spiritual seriousness, and embodied action work in concert. The modern subject lives by file, yet the file attains its full value only when it opens onto realities larger than its own administrative frame. What then of the uncanny itself? I have spoken of grammar, yet one further pressure asks for attention. In Dracula, the uncanny arises through a crisis of hospitality, through thresholds that admit a presence they cannot master and domestic forms that receive what exceeds their own civil promise. bedrooms, ships, cabbies, asylums, drawing rooms, suburban properties, chapels, graveyards, and mountain roads all become scenes in which host and intruder exchange functions with disturbing ease. Dracula appears as host in Transylvania, captive presence in England, commanding force at the edge of the asylum, trespasser in Lucy's room, claimant upon Mina, fugitive carried within his own box. Harker enters as guest, then passes into captivity. England imagines itself the host of a foreign property transfer, only to discover that legal welcome has opened a way for predation. Hospitality, so often taken as an emblem of civil order, acquires teeth within that reversal. Shelter turns porous, welcome becomes perilous. Home receives the traffic of the night road. At that social depth, the uncanny reveals one of its sharpest forms. I can therefore answer the opening question: which force truly governs Dracula, the gush of blood or the page that receives its report? Blood gives the novel urgency and furnishes it with kinship, race thought, sacrament, vitality, contamination, inheritance, erotic peril, mortality, and the body's final cost. Yet the page receives blood into memory, while the archive converts wound into sequence and gathers scattered crises into an intelligible order. Within that packet of papers, assembled against night, one encounters the novel's deepest conviction. Modern life meets terror through compilation. Stoker understood that empire, law, medicine, religion, transport, domesticity, love, fear, male vow, female labor, race panic, family hope, ancient legend, urban pressure, maritime record, foreign war memory, peasant custom, scientific ambition, criminal pursuit, typist's discipline, and the old appetite of the grave had entered the same file by the century's end. Dracula gives that file a face. That face remains terrible chiefly through what it seeks to inherit. Dracula desires more than victims, for his appetite reaches toward futurity, toward England conceived as feeding ground, field of property, horizon of reproduction, and archive of conquest renewed within the metropolis itself. Old blood moves through him into the center of imperial circulation. Opposed to that design stands a fragile fellowship whose victory depends upon common record, mutual risk, and collective acts of reading. The novel therefore discloses a truth its popular afterlife sometimes leaves in shadow. Beneath the scenes of sex, religion, race, and death lies a deeper struggle over transmission itself. The future of blood story, title, child memory, paper trail, England, Europe, and the shape of what comes next. The night road carries all those claims together. Stoker places a packet in our hands so that we may feel its weight. I would go further. The packet itself becomes the moral image of the work. For papers gathered from disparate hands signify a form of community forged under immortal pressure and held together by the shared labor of testimony. A single witness cannot carry the whole burden. Any one discipline meets only part of the field. A solitary nation holds only a partial purchase upon the threat. Each medium preserves a distinct fraction of the record. Each medium supplies what another lacks. The journal gives duration, the telegram gives speed, folklore carries knowledge beyond medicine's reach, local memory extends the grasp of law, Mina's ordering intelligence gives masculine action coherence, practical route planning steadies Christian symbol in the world of pursuit, and transcription grants courage a durable form. Here the novel discloses its hardest wisdom, for the uncanny breaks every fantasy of solitary mastery and yields, when yield it does, before a coalition able to read across forms, methods, and modes of evidence. That coalition carries the mark of its own historical conditions. British Empire passes through the struggle charged with its own violence. Patriarchal authority enters the record bearing visible strain. Race thinking leaves its stain upon the page. Female figures carry an excessive burden of emblematic meaning. Foreignness receives an atmosphere heavy with dread. Part of Dracula's greatness lies in the way its form registers pressures that its declared moral language cannot bring into full repose. A healed ending stands as the novel's desire, yet the archive keeps the wound before the reader's eyes. Secured bloodlines stand among its aims, yet the narrative has already shown blood moving unpredictably across bodies, classes, nations, rights, and desires. The inherited assurance of Christian England also commands its longing, yet the book's procedures depend upon technical modernity, urban mobility, multinational cooperation, imported knowledge, and female intellectual agency. Within that unresolved richness, the novel continues to live. I began with the packet, and there I end. A sheaf of papers lies upon the table. Calm observation inhabits certain pages. Panic presses through others. Shorthand marks one sheet. Typescript gives another its texture. Maritime passage gives rise to part of the record. The asylum supplies another portion. Further pages come from the bedroom under siege, from railway planning, from mountain pursuit. Together they form an archive set against oblivion. Blood darkens the body, archive darkens the page. Between those two forms lies the strange mastery of Bram Stoker's novel. Dracula endures through its early recognition that the modern world would inherit its nightmares in documentary form. The vampire enters through the wound. History keeps him through the file.